So today's session will be led by my friend and colleague, Shane Chagpar. Shane is one of our senior consultants here at Kepner-Tregoe and leads our service excellence space in North America. My name's David Frank. I'm a relationship manager with Kepner-Tregoe, and I will kind of be the master of ceremonies walking you through today's event. So without further ado, we're going to turn this over to the capable hands of Shane and let him jump into his presentation. Shane, over to you.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining the webinar. Today, we're going to be talking about a disaster that happened a long time ago and trying to make it helpful for you to take complex disasters that you may have already gone through at your organization, or use sort of the crystal ball of tools that we're going to try to put together for you so you can be a little bit more proactive about handling these kinds of issues in the future. Now, the problem with incident management is we kind of all wish we had that crystal ball, the ability to see into the future, prepare for failure, and then be ready in such a way that when a triggering event occurs, we're all ready to fight the fire, ready to put it out, and there's as minimal damage as possible. I feel like the dream of an incident manager is that they're heralded as a hero and nothing terrible happens and nobody finds out. It's something that just gets solved in the middle of the night. But unfortunately, this isn't the case, and our tools aren't necessarily that great. In fact, if I was to take a look at a typical incident report, it kind of looks a little bit like this. Usually there's some documentation about if the customer was allowed to have an incident, what level they were maybe paying for of service. So they'd come through our service desk or some sort of event monitoring, and we'd take some notes. Our subject line might be what we think is the problem statement. Usually it's vague, not very clear. And hopefully when the subject matter experts get on the line, they'll figure it all out and get to the bottom of this. The end result at the end of an incident is a reverse chronological document describing what happened, when people came on, and what we did to solve the problem. And this, as we know, isn't necessarily the best way for us to be able to describe an incident. So today, I'm going to take the Titanic, a disaster we all feel we are familiar with, might not know the details of, and try to document it using our current standards, and then show you a way to map this visually so you could do better post-mortems immediately, and maybe one day use this in reverse as a proactive management tool. So let's take a look at the Titanic through the eyes of current reporting. Well, when it comes to current reporting, and White Star Line is the owner of the Titanic, what they might have reported might look a little bit different if we were to put it through the tools of today. So, of course, we'd have a problem statement. Everyone that knows Kepner-Tregoe realizes how important that is. So it would probably be RMS Titanic sank. We would have a root cause that our experts would figure out, and they might actually point to a triggering event rather than a root cause. They'll say, well, a collision with the iceberg is what clearly sank the Titanic. So then we'll muddle about, probably having some meetings, and we'll get some lessons learned generated. So we'll say, okay, well, you know, maybe in the future, these big things, we should try not to hit them. And then finally, we'll report up to our executives a communication plan. We'll make sure that everyone in customer service recognizes the known issue that, you know what, if you've got icebergs, they're going to sink your ships. So if you're a shipbuilder or someone who owns a series of ships, and your ship sank, don't come crying to us. It was clearly in our knowledge base. It was a known issue. And then we sometimes pat ourselves on the back. But we know that this isn't exactly the type of reporting that we want to have going forward. This reporting kind of sucks. And the main reason why is because it lacks detail, lacks our depth. It's very obvious. It's too simple. It basically has all the components of what I like to call rainbow ice cream. It's a report that didn't help anyone but generated a lot of work. And we want to avoid this type of rainbow ice cream reporting in the future. So I take a look at the Titanic and tried to figure out, based on Wikipedia, what was the kind of full story behind this. And that's what I'm going to share with you today. So the first thing I did was I took a look at the 31 pages on Wikipedia. I printed them out so I can start highlighting. And again, I did my best to start taking down notes. And the way I took down notes was very similar to how we do it in a network operations center. I started taking down bullet points. So it was described as practically unthinkable. It had a maiden voyage. It was the last voyage for Mr. Captain Smith. And I started going down through all these bullet points. And you'll see halfway through, I smartened up. I started adding timestamps because I was like, oh, timestamps might be important. Timelines are going to be important in the way I make this presentation. And what I noticed after about 15 to 20 bullet points was that I'm having the same problem. I'm creating my own version of a rainbow ice cream report. This is, again, a series of facts, but not one that helps my future discussions with my team, my manager, or my executives. This data doesn't help me remediate an issue. It might point to a root cause, but it'll probably generate more questions than it does productive discussion. So today, what I'd like to cover with you is a lesson plan for creating a really good visual map of a complex incident. I would imagine that the immediate place that you can put this to use is in post-mortem incidents, right after a major incident. And then, like I said, I'll also be putting some information at the end about how you can use this to proactively monitor an incident. There's a couple things that we're going to be discussing. The first thing we're going to be discussing is this concept of direct causes or triggers. And we're going to be looking at those direct causes or triggers and trying to put together a story that we can tell. We'll then look at some vulnerabilities, things that exist, they're lurking, they're latent, and they can come to bite you at any time. The next thing we're going to talk about is circumstances, how to tell a story where, you know, luck just wasn't on your side that day. Or maybe luck was on your side, but how do you relate the fact that we saved the day by luck, and in the future we want to invest resources so we don't have to rely on luck to get the job done. And then the final thing is going to be a discussion about what we call barriers, controls, and governance. And it's these four things, direct causes, vulnerabilities, circumstances, and governance, that are typically your vectors towards a failure. So when it comes to proactive thinking, if you can start with these four categories and sort of break down what's happening in your organization, that's how we would approach proactive problem management and be able to get ahead of a particular failure. So let's start with sort of the story of an event chain. So an event chain is something for which multiple things usually happen. There's a series of failures, and then finally the last domino to topple is the one that hurts you. And making an event chain is really simple. We're going to do this using like Visio or PowerPoint, and we're just going to create some flowcharts. The first flowchart we're going to deal with is just vertical. And as you go up this vertical flowchart, we're talking about what we call effects. And as we go down the flowchart, we're going to be talking about a cause. So in this example, the Titanic sank. If you go down, it's talking about the cause. Why did it sink? It hit an iceberg. If you were to read this in reverse, it's we hit an iceberg. We're going up. What did that cause? What was the outcome of hitting an iceberg? Well, the Titanic sank. The best way for you to start to put together this story is to use Post-it notes. Usually I get a team. We all start to write down the parts of the story that we know, or I get each member of the team to work on a different part of the story, and then we eventually start to go to a wall and visually organize it. Only after it's visually organized on a wall do I usually organize it professionally in Visio, PowerPoint, or whatever tool you're using. So let's expand this a bit. As we start expanding it, we're going to start to see the story unfold. Your cause and effect chain will grow. In this particular case, the Titanic sank. Why? Because it was flooded. Why? Because there was a hull breach, and that's how water got in. Why? Well, a hull breach requires that the hull strength was exceeded. And also, there's an and in this one, that we hit an iceberg. In this particular chain, there's different definitions we have for some of these things, which many people refer to as the cause. And because in our industry, we don't actually have like a true, solid, single, universally accepted definition, I'm going to give you these ones for us to be able to talk through this presentation. So we have an undesired outcome. That's at the very top. That's the bad thing that happened. At the very bottom, we have our root cause and direct cause, often known as a triggering event. And then in between, we have what we call intermediate causes. Now, your day-to-day incidents might not have a very big chain. It might be 2 or 3 items. In fact, a lot of the major incidents that I was on also don't have a very large map, which is why I selected the Titanic example, because it has a huge map, which you can see on the next slide here. So on this particular map, you'll notice that there's 3 major categories at the top: assets, product, and safety. I started to categorize the business areas of impact so I can tell a large story. Now, one of these stories is the safety space. And in the safety space, the way that you want to start reading these stories is sort of one leg at a time. So on this particular highlighted leg, we said, you know, there was a safety concern because lives were lost, because there was drowning. Why was there drowning? Because there was a lot of hours before these people were rescued. There was a nearby ship that failed to assist. The reason why it didn't assist was it turned off its radio for the night. And the reason why it turned off its radio for the night was because the operator was tired and went to bed. This is just one telling of the story of why there was a failure. And as you scroll through, you'll start to see other stories of why this ship failed to assist. And one of the reasons was we didn't respond to distress signals because they were the wrong color, and we didn't want to wake our radio operator. Another major leg of this problem was that there were people that were exposed to frigid water. If we had only had a situation where there was many hours to rescue, probably a lot of people could have survived, but not when they were in this cold water. And the reason why that was the case was because we had our ship sank, it flooded. We exceeded the water containment that we were able to hold for that ship. And the reason why was because the Titanic, which was actually designed to have 2 out of 4 of its major hulls full of water, had a customer design modification. Think of it as a firewall change. And it sort of messed everything up for that fluid system. Other stories that are sometimes told is that the hull was breached because the strength was exceeded. 2 reasons for that. We had defective rivets, which a lot of people know, but the story that most don't is that our hull was made factory in England. And at that factory in England, the previous product used a different kind of metal, and inside the furnace, there was traces of that metal. So when we created this steel hull, what we ended up creating was an alloy without realizing that we were creating an alloy. And these kinds of stories just begin to unfold. We couldn't steer clear of our icebergs because there was not enough time to react, because we were going too fast, because there was a competition to cross. We had also changed the rudder design. And because of the rudder design, it's not able to turn the boat as fast. Current evidence suggests that if we didn't even try to change the direction of the boat, we would have avoided the iceberg just naturally. And then you can continue to read through this yourself as you see the other stories that were told. Things like we didn't have access to the binocular keys. We decided not to have additional lifeboats because they would clutter the look of the deck. So this was a series of failures that caused this story to happen. And by mapping it this way, you can, with the same level of emotion, tell the story effectively. And I think that's the first part of being able to do a post-mortem and get to being productive rather than fighting over who did what. So the second part of our lesson is adding what we call circumstances. And circumstances are just things that happened, sometimes positive, sometimes negative, that just made a bad situation worse. In this particular case, these firefighters, not only do they have to fight the fire, but it's probably slow for them to do so because they got to walk around in hip-deep water. There also is a circumstance here where some houses maybe didn't catch fire, thankfully, because there was so much water around. So how do we document these sort of lucky things that are occurring in our environment? Well, we use the thing called circumstances. And the way we document circumstances is we just go to the left of any individual chain and we start to document a plus or a minus and then describe a lucky event. We would describe a lucky event with a plus if it accelerated the chain. So plus is bad. It made the fire worse. It made it spread quicker. We would document with a negative if it slowed down the overall speed of the chain. So in this particular case, hypothermia and drowning, it got way worse because that particular night it was moonless. The water temperatures had dropped near freezing. The nice thing was that there was a lot of different ships responding to the emergency, which probably made a bad situation better instead of worse. The hours until rescue, the thing that made that worse was that the Titanic operator was actually using the old version of SOS called CQD. And it was documented that one of the operators turned to the other operator almost in the last minute and said, hey, you know, why don't we try the new SOS? We're sinking anyways. What's the worst that'll happen? And as soon as they read out that SOS instead of a CQD type signal, ships started to respond. The bad thing, though, was that the second ship was more than 4 hours away. There was a ship nearby that failed to assist, telling the story or the circumstance of why it didn't. The Titanic operator actually told that ship to shut up because it was too chatty on the radio. So they were already turning off their radio and not responding to us. They tried to send more slurp signals to the Titanic, but the nearby Titanic was not able to see the Morse signal because the light was not bright enough. And then it was very late at night and all the captains were exhausted. So you can imagine if this was an IT incident, sometimes our team is prepared for a failure, but isn't prepared for the type of failure we had. Or it was late at night and you know what? The person we normally page out at 3 a.m., they were on vacation. So rather than telling it in the story and risk being told that you're simply making excuses to the management, document it as circumstances. Each of these items could individually be considered an excuse for failure, but when you visually see it this way, a manager, team lead, or project manager can start to understand that there was a lot going on and you did the best you could in the situation you were in. So the next slide that we want to be able to get to is elevating weak controls. So we want to make it very visible that there is a governance issue going on that could be improved in the future. So when it comes to governance issues, usually we put in policies to help us make sure we avoid a failure. In this particular case, we wanted to make sure that we had protection from cars on the bicycle lane. Of course, when the right hand doesn't talk to the left hand so well, the implementation can go a little bit poorly, as you could see, for these poor cyclists on the right-hand lane. Documenting this, the way we would do it is we'd go back to our chain, And in our chain, we would document on the right-hand side, the things that were designed to be fire extinguishers, and we'll document the fire extinguishers that failed. This way you can tell, again, executive leadership or anyone else that was on this particular incident, such as the customer, that, we had a power outage at the location that we were at. Yes, we had backup batteries. There was 2 rows of backup batteries that failed. The remaining 2 rows, their power was at the regular rate. And maybe one of the circumstances were that this was a prolonged outage for the area because it was a problem with the main grid. So you'd be able to use storytelling through the center spine, circumstances for why this went on longer, and a breached barrier that shows your actual failure, which was maybe 2 of your battery banks out of 4 failed prematurely when they weren't supposed to. In the case of the Titanic, the lifeboats failed to keep passengers safe because there wasn't enough of them, and some of them were not in good condition. The entire purpose of a lifeboat is to save lives. It didn't do so. The other area where we failed was we had these rockets. They were supposed to convey emergencies. Unfortunately, we would use the same rockets for celebrations as we would emergencies. The nearby ships thought we were simply lighting off some fireworks to celebrate something and didn't realize that we had an actual emergency going on. Now what we want to do is document our causes. So we want to start to put this all together and see how all of these items touch each other to create this major incident, or how do all these vectors combine to make things worse. So there are 4 causes, as I said, of a major incident at the beginning of the call. The better that you can pinpoint where you have these failure points in your organization in advance, the better you can handle a major incident if it occurs. So we have direct causes, vulnerabilities, circumstances, and breached barriers. So the first area we're going to look at is organizing our direct causes. So I'll go to my map and I'll pull this into my flow chart. So my direct causes, we had ship speed, we had the course that we chose, and we had a competition that was going on. These were direct causes that led to the Titanic failure. The triggering event, as we know, was obviously hitting an iceberg. We did have some vulnerabilities or lurking latent animals that could bite us, and these included, we had the unsuitable alloy for the ship, we had the defective iron rivets, we had low lifeboat capacity, we had low water containment capacity, we didn't have egress paths or exit paths for the lower decks, and we also didn't have a good rudder design going on. And each of these things individually could have contributed to a failure, but with all of these vulnerabilities being set off at once, it became quite a disaster. Some of the circumstances that we were in, we had freezing water going outside, we had ultra calm conditions, so it's very hard to spot something like an iceberg in front of us. We had to rely on the second closest ship instead of our first, and it was sleepy time, so people were tired. And then, of course, we had some breached barriers, things that we should have had in control, but failed to stop this issue from accelerating. We had flare and signaling response failures, evacuation procedure failures. How prepared were we to use the lifeboats? The on-ship alarm wasn't working, so everyone didn't realize that there was even a failure. Iceberg warning communications were generally ignored because when ships communicate iceberg warnings back then, it was over the radio. And unlike today, the radio back then was used for first-class passengers to send and receive messages of business rather than ship-to-ship emergency communications. So this is now the summary of sort of our entire map that we came up with. What we'll do with this summarized map is we'll take it into a meeting, we'll go sit down with maybe our customer, team leads, managers, all of our stakeholders, and either in a pre-meeting with SMEs or all together as one, we want to start to master risk planning so that this doesn't happen again. And I'll show you an easy way to be able to do that. When it comes to risk planning, the important thing is not looking at final failure. In this picture, the person falling off this ramp. You kind of want to use slices of time. Imagine a failure and then take a snapshot of every moment leading to that failure, up to that failure, and at and after the failure point. Because for each of these things, you probably have something you could have done to prevent it going sideways. Or if you're ready to pull the plug, you know, we don't want to have a back out plan initiated when we have 1,000 users unable to serve plan ready, maybe when our change window is suddenly closing and we're not anywhere near being able to fix this. That's when you want to be able to call a back out plan to start. So here's a quick way for you to be able to look at these two sides of this risk equation, the preventative side and the containment side. What you'll do is that previous diagram we came up with that had our direct causes, vulnerabilities, circumstances, and barriers, you want to feed them through this algorithm. So first, filter things that are in your control, things that you can actually do. And the first side of it is ask yourself, what are the triggering events that would cause that kind of failure? So what would cause my data center to go down? What would cause my services to go down? What would cause my users to be unhappy? And then for each of those things that you came up with, ask yourself, how can we prevent that? Float the ideas, get them assigned to people, and put into plan those preventative measures. On the other side, take a look at the containment. Just like we had that skateboarder with slices of time, take a look at all of the slices of time of a failure. So sometimes I call this the temperature of pain. So for your users, what's the temperature of pain? We have 1 user unable to connect, 5 users, 10 users, 100 users, 1,000 users, 100,000 users, and maybe your entire user base. I think that would be the thermometer of pain. And for each of those levels, you want to ask yourself, okay, what are you going to do to prevent further damage? So when we have 5 users out, what kind of actions are you going to take? I don't think sending an email to your entire user base would be a good idea if only 5 users were affected. But maybe if 10,000 users were affected, you'd want to be able to send out that kind of email to your entire user base. Being able to have those conversations in advance of a failure is important, so everyone knows the action plan that you're going to put into place when bad things happen. So, going back to the Titanic example, what were some of the things that were put into place after the Titanic sank that helped change the industry? So we have these divided into preventative items and containment items. In order to prevent a failure like this, they said all vessels now have to be equipped with radios that were for captain and ship-to-ship communication that had backup power and 24/7 monitoring by staff. This would prevent our issue of someone falling asleep, the power running out, or having to relay messages on the business channels. Safety training and drills now became mandatory. Critical construction materials now had government-mandated inspections. You were not allowed to have competitions with passengers aboard. There was a maximum speed that you were now allowed to use in ice fields. And the requirements for construction were modified for all ships in the future. On the containment side, we now have new rules for standardizing red as the color for emergency flares. And unlike the Titanic, where on the Titanic, our lifeboat capacity was based on the tonnage of cargo you were carrying, we now changed that metric so that you now have to have 120% of people, not cargo, worth of life rafts. Egress paths now got better signage. You had better exit signage to be able to get out, and everyone that comes on the ship was safety briefed. So what we've done is we've used our preventative and containment algorithm and our map to further a conversation with our stakeholders and say, look, I get it, I get it, I get it. We shouldn't have had this competition. I get it, I get it, I get it. We shouldn't have chose cheap rivets. Being able to push that conversation forward and saying, look, what are we going to do about this now is where your head should be at after a major incident, instead of stuck in the weeds, arguing and pointing fingers. And I think that really helps us get you there. So let me review and sort of put this all together. When I'm putting it all together, we want to take a look at these direct causes, vulnerabilities, circumstances, and barriers in such a way that we can be ready for when a failure occurs. I also want to show you how to be able to do this in advance of a major incident by using these same techniques, which is, I think, a little bit harder to do than using this as post-mortem, but it is definitely something we do with some of our clients. So first, I want to bring up those 4 categories. If you want to be able to use this to proactively manage major incidents, you first have to take a look at your organization, and for these categories, start to come up with all the areas where you can have your potential failures. You're going to have to come up with a story, right? And when you come up with that story, you're also going to have to prioritize your stories. Otherwise, every story sounds like a major disaster to your company. So some of the areas that you can start to look in for triggers is take a look at all the things that you do that are human error prone. Can we automate some of those? Can we protect or script them? Can we use some sort of platform where we can minimize introduction of errors via human error? So other areas like this is physical space. Like I see a lot of incidents caused by storage still. A server runs out of hard disk space. Like, can we involve any monitoring on any of these things? Because these direct triggers, they're the iceberg that will start a series of cascading failures for you. There's vulnerabilities that exist within your plans. You know, poor planning gets to poor performance. Of course, everyone that makes a plan, if they knew it was poor, they obviously wouldn't do it or follow it. So maybe you can get some sort of audit or checks on major things that you might be doing. Take a look at your software age, your platform, your architecture. How much tech debt exists in those spaces? And are these MacGyver type tech debts where we've you know, instead of fixing a pipe, we've put a bucket underneath it, and then to make just before the bucket gets full, we have a pump that pumps it outside? Like, do we have all these things put together in a very House of Cards-like moment? Or is this just debt that will roll over when we change to a new version or get solved in the future on its own? So we need to categorize this debt. Circumstances might exist within your teams. I mean, your resource levels, maybe some of your offshore teams don't have the subject matter expertise as your onshore teams, which again, it puts bullseyes at certain times of days. So, you know, our night shift doesn't have what they need to be able to get things done. So if anything happens at night, we might be in a situation where we might have a problem. So try to imagine some of these accelerants or deaccelerants in your company. Who or what are they? And let's start to capture some of those so we can start to see a story of how is our house built. And then finally, your governance system. These are the fire extinguishers that you think you have in place. When's the last time those fire extinguishers were checked? When's the last time your battery backups were actually tested? When's the last time that a emergency plan was tested? Because we don't know of all the changes that are happening in our organization. It is absolutely possible that a plan that made sense one day, like maybe a fire exit route, is now blocked because of new construction and things did not get updated the way we thought they did. I see this a lot with network diagrams and network equipment. So the whole reason we give our incident managers network diagrams is so that they can solve and isolate things. If those remain out of date, you now have a barrier, control, or governance issue that could bite you if a major incident gets triggered. So what we kind of covered today was we covered a storytelling method to visually map when something bad happens. We used a spine to tell the story. To the left of the spine was all the things that sort of made it worse faster or made it better, thankfully. To the right of that spine was all those items that should have stopped this from occurring but failed to do so. And then we took that story, we summarized it, and we put together an action plan of preventative and containment measures for the future. We then looked at how can you use the 4 categories of where an incident begins and how to look at your organization to sort of categorize things in those 4 categories so you can then prioritize them and try to predict where are our big gaps. Closing those gaps and remediating major incidents we'll probably have to save for another webcast, but those are clearly very important because if you don't remediate after a major incident, it's bound to return. And if you don't close your audit gaps that you find using this method, well then you're leaving yourself vulnerable to an issue coming forward. Being able to resource and make sure that those things happen is an important part of driving your customer experience engine. But I hope you enjoyed this first run through telling a story, finding out where things can fail, and progressing a conversation from blame to a conversation of productive change. We'll now open up the floor for questions.
Again, you have the ability to ask questions in, I believe, the upper left-hand corner of the screen. Thank you for those of you who have sent some during the course of the presentation. What I'd like to do is actually take a couple of those and as you all are adding to them, start answering them. So we had 2 specific questions that I think link really well together. So the first one is, what do you do when a prevention you are recommending doesn't get the funding from the business to be implemented? The challenge is always convincing the business of level of risk. Any advice on how to navigate this pitfall? And I want to combine that with a question that says, why do you need governance? And what major deliverables should be included in governance? So in terms of governance, it is so important to have those individuals in your organization that are looking at the long view and saying, are we going to invest in this or not? And those people need to be at a decision-making level. It's also incredibly important to have those folks that raise the risks, do the analysis, and present the facts, much like the visual way that Shane showed you today. So why do you need governance? Because you need somebody to make a decision and be okay with the amount of risk that the business is taking on. How do you make your presentations, I guess, more effective? One of the ways I think Shane showed you today is actually show the map. Here's how it affects the organization. Here's why. Here's all the contributing causes. Here's where we see that you need additional information, additional barriers, et cetera, and building a case for that. And then Shane, I'm gonna ask you to take a third question here that I think also dovetails with this nicely, and it says, what role do you see for FMEA in this process?
Okay, so there's 2 there. What role do I see for FMEA? So failure mode effect analysis, or FMEA, allows us to pinpoint vulnerabilities. It's really good at showing that second category of vector that creates a major incident. So if you were to use a visual tool like FMEA to come up with the vulnerabilities, that would be excellent. But then obviously you still have to balance and combine those with the circumstances, barriers, and controls and direct causes that could create that major incident. The other question that we had was, how do we get people to fund, how do you get people to basically not treat me like Chicken Little and think that I'm just raising a concern where a concern doesn't exist? This requires a little bit more work. What I normally do in order to help an organization prioritize where they should focus their remediation funding, which is for some reason always tight funding, is you're going to have to go through your incidents of the past and maybe take a look at your priority 2s and 1s from the last 6 months. I'll start to organize and categorize by manually going through those incidents. What was the technology, space, or asset that this failed on, and what was our initial or actual root causes? What I'll then do is I'll start to put together a graph, and that graph will say something along the lines of human error in the firewall changes was our biggest factor in major incidents or minor incidents in the last 6 months. Our second category might have been X, our third category might have been Y. Any funding in these areas is where we should prioritize our work. And that allows you to have a objective conversation about things that you are fearing in the future. We're going to take a look at some other questions. A dedicated resource to manage.
So this type of analysis takes time and quite often a dedicated resource to manage the process. How do you set up the justification to get the necessary human and support resources to do this?
So that I think I just covered. Was you actually have to first categorize where the failures are occurring and in what area. The second thing I would add on is, let's say I go back to my example, firewall changes are the biggest, creator of incidents in an organization. What I would then do is add up the outage time and or add up the people time it took to solve the issue. Multiply that people time by an overhead cost that would work for you, a fully loaded overhead cost. I usually use 75 or 80 bucks per hour. So if we had an incident going on for 4 hours, we had 5 people involved, $80 a head, you now have a dollar value of what that incident cost the organization. If you have a lot of those incidents happening, you have a big dollar value that then you can throw around. Be careful though, that dollar value isn't going to equal actual savings if you remediate. It's just going to equal free time for your already paid resources, so that they can devote themselves to more important tasks. But that's generally how you'd raise the ROI, so you can have those remediation dollars given to you.
Great. I think the next question is one that we are wildly familiar with in this space, and it's how do you balance the difference between incident and problem management, specifically when incident management asks for you to do as many things as quickly as possible and sometimes destroys the information you need for problem management?
Oh, I like this one. So incident management destroys some of the information for problem management. Obviously, they don't do this on purpose. They might reset a router that kills the logs. Problem management then has a harder time. So take this answer with a grain of salt. I mean, I work for the company. What I would normally recommend is the way that you document an incident must dovetail into the way that we solve a problem as best as possible. The reason why I said take this with a grain of salt is because I would recommend using is nots, what, where, when, extent as a framework, which is a KT framework, to document your incident. There is no way that I would ask an incident manager to actually fill out an is and is not spec. However, for information they capture what I call for free, or just by nature of solving the incident, you captured this information, at least document it in a way that the next guys on the scene or the next people on the scene, which is your problem managers, they'll be able to sort through the stuff that's there. Usually the required items that I ask an incident manager to gather so the problem management folks are not screwed is what specifically failed, in what symptoms did it fail, what symptoms could we have seen it fail on but did not, what items or objects did not fail, So we have 2 out of 4 batteries, which 2 batteries? And then finally, we capture what we call the life cycle. So when in the process of operation did this item fail? And usually, those 3 footholds are extremely strong and allow problem management to do their job, even if other data like logs might have been trashed.
Great. The next question is, how do you make sure an organization is prepared or ready to implement this approach? And I'm going to take this one on. Anytime you implement a new process, it's all about maturity steps, not going from 0 to 100 in one step. So if you don't have good documentation in place, you don't have good monitoring in place, you don't have systems and data and information, it's very difficult to then accurately predict what could go wrong and when it could go wrong. So how do we make sure an organization is ready? We essentially do an assessment and say, where are you at in your maturity journey, and what's the next logical step for you to take? And then ask, how many steps do you want to take before you're going to feel like you're at a place where you're good at this? So that's the way that I would say, how do you make sure that the organization's ready, is you do an assessment based on what maturity level you're at, and that maturity level takes into account technology and a common way of asking questions and gathering data and information, a common way of working together both between silos and in individual organizations. So looking at those drivers around people, process, metrics, and tooling, and understanding where you're at in that maturity journey, and really asking you just to take the next step, not the next 10. The next question we see is, hey, what's the difference from this and a fishbone? And if you're familiar with the fishbone diagram, I think you would know some wild differences in the approach that Shane took today. What I will say is that the fishbone really gives you a good place to start to look for where barriers might not be in place, where failure points could occur. So looking at Mother Nature and man and machining and all those other things that are in the fishbone diagram are really great places to start poking around for holes in your environment.
Also on the fishbone, we're basically going to be dealing only with causes. We will lose the opportunity to document things like a breached barrier, a circumstance which made it worse or better, or pushing into what are we going to do about it afterwards. So the fishbone covers one area, very good for problem solving because it deals with where possible causes could come from, but it doesn't tell the full story, whereas this is a storytelling method rather than a data hypothesis generation method.
You guys are inundating us with questions, so just give us a moment as we work through them here. Shane, I think this is a great question, and it dovetails off another one, so there's 2 together here. If you already have the KT approach in your organization, how does this fit? And what previous KT knowledge would the organization need in order to use this process?
This one's really good. So although this isn't the best sales answer, you don't need any KT process in or installed in your organization in order to use this method. I think that's why we tried to tackle it during a 1-hour masterclass, because this storytelling method kind of sits alone. I've been asked sometimes to take a major incident that took a full day to review. One of my famous ones is from a major gorilla in the networking company, and it was a 232-page document of outages, and we used this method to do the entire presentation in 4 slides. So you don't need to know is not decision-making. If you do have KT installed, I mean, potential problem analysis has its place in this very strongly. And if you're using problem analysis, that can help you find root cause. So if you do have those 2 tools, this helps very strongly. Oftentimes we refer to this map as advanced situation appraisal. So if you have those KT tools installed, you can use them quite well, but you do not need them in order to be effective with this process.
I'm going to take one last question before we close it out here. And that question is, hey, jumping to conclusions, for example, before detailed root cause analysis is complete and false assumptions are equally counterproductive. How frequently do you find that you have to caution people against these pitfalls? And do you have examples you like to use to highlight the importance of detailed root cause analysis?
Yeah, so when we're telling the story, we actually use something I didn't get to teach in this session. We actually use colors on the main spine. So when we're looking at that main spine and we're going through cause and effect and we say, you know what, the hull was breached, and we go down and we say, because of defective alloy or defective rivets, you're supposed to only be able to allow to put that box there if it's a confirmed root cause of the box above it. However, when we're sometimes in the middle of an investigation, we don't know if that's the confirmed root cause. So what we do is we use two sets of colors. We use a dark red or a white box alone to have a confirmed cause, and we use a light pink color to indicate that this still remains a hypothesis. And basically, a hypothesis is anything which still has a series of assumptions for which an observation, a test, or a confirmed true root cause has not been done. So to answer that question, yes, happens all the time during the storytelling. How do we deal with it? We just change the color of the Post-it note so that we know that we're dealing with a hypothesis. If you have a ton of those pink Post-it notes everywhere, well, you still got some investigation to do. Kind of dovetailing onto a previous question, not all investigations are worth it. And a lot of management seems to think, you know, every time I have a major incident, I got to have an investigation. I'm sorry, that's just not the case. Sometimes a major incident occurs in an area that we might be deprecating, we might not care about in the future, or we've already said that we're not spending money in that area. Sometimes getting to true root cause in those areas, it's just not, there's just no ROI in it because it's not predicted to return, in which case you'll have a map with tons of those pink stickies, and we'll just leave it with the story that we know, assumptions and all.
Well, Shane, thanks for your time today, and thank you for walking us through this and the answers to your questions. For those of you in the audience that did not have one of your questions answered, you'll see on the screen in front of you the contact information for both Shane and myself. Feel free to reach out to us via email. We'd be happy to have a conversation with you, answer some of your questions that may not have gotten taken care of here during the work session. So a couple things to tie up the day. We take these sessions very seriously, and we're really interested to know if you found this valuable. So please do us a favor and rate this session using the Rate This button on your console, or better yet, reach out to one of us with questions or thoughts on the topic. We'll follow up with you through email with a recorded copy of this presentation, as well as, I believe, the slides we'll be sending you as well. And on behalf of Kepner-Tregoe, Shane, myself, thanks again for your time. Wish you a great day wherever you're at in the world. Thanks so much, and thank you for joining us today.